Good morning, all. My name is, for those of you who do not know me, my name is Naomi Thompson, and I am the Associate Vice President of the Office of Community Equity and Diversity, and I am delighted that you all are here to participate in this launch of our Community Equity and Diversity Strategic Plan. And Joanna has been so great as to put an evolution of what plans have developed as strategic plans over the course of the past few years here at the University of Rhode Island. And this plan is born out of the President's transformational goals, which you all may be familiar with. And it has evolved out of the University of Rhode Island's academic strategic plan. And it follows the pattern of the University of Rhode Island's IT strategic plan. So this is a plan that is for all of us, that it is about all of us embracing the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion here at the University of Rhode Island. But before I take too much time getting into what the plan is about, I did want to take time to thank individuals who had contributed to this document, who had put years of work and effort and planning into the document. And so I just ask you to indulge me, because even though when I'm sitting where you are and people start listing a whole bunch of names, it makes me crazy. I think that because of the amount of work that has gone into this, I want you to recognize all the individuals, or many of the individuals who have been involved. So the lead scribe, Joanna Ravello. Dr. Joanna Ravello started about a year ago in September, and from her first day, this was her main charge, was to make sense of this document. And she looked at a number of documents from the Equity Council, from Community Equity and Diversity, from all of the presidential commissions that are represented here, the President's Commission on the Status of Women, on people with disabilities, on faculty, staff, and students of color, recommendations from veterans groups, recommendations from the various different diversity committees and councils all across the university. But she also looked at theory. She looked at various different other universities' strategic plans, and she looked at inclusive excellence best practices. And we combined all of these documents together into that 10-page document, which I think she had hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents that we started with and narrowed it down to this. But I want to also thank Ann Morrissey. Did I see Ann Morrissey in the room? Where's Ann? So we're just going to recognize Ann Morrissey, and I recognize her as being the organizational development queen and guru who we go to for issues like this to guide us as to how we craft a document like this. I want to give a special acknowledgement to Barbara Karen, who helped us edit the document, and Johnson Ma, who created this wonderful layout and the pictures. I'm not going to go into as much detail with other folks, so I'm just going to list them. Kelly Mahoney, Linda Achardo, Jody Redlick, all the marketing and communications staff. Of course, the president and the provost, who read this over and over and over again. And the reason why I point them out as reading this over and over again is because this is the university's strategic plan. This is not just a guide for CED and the folks who work in the Women's Center, the Multicultural Center, the Gender and Sexuality Center, Affirmative Action, and in CED proper to do our work, but this is for everyone to have a guide to say, this is how we want to begin to think about how we can better recruit, retain, and infuse diversity into the community here at the University of Rhode Island. We want to acknowledge the folks from the senior leadership team who also read this over and over again. Dr. Kathy Collins, who is here, Michelle Carreri, Abigail Ryder, A.D. Thor Bjorn, who is here, yay, 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 and Jerry Sonnenfeld, Kelly, who is also part of that senior leadership team, and Lil O'Rourke. The members of the CED staff, and I would ask that you all stand up as we name you, because you have been spending years and years and years thinking up the content of this document. So one of the newest members of our community, George Galen, please stand up. Please remain standing as we name, with George Van Ness Bobron works with him, but he's not here. We have Roxanne Gomes and Gerard Holder, who do affirmative action, equal opportunity, and diversity. Could you stay standing? Penny Rosenthal from the Women's Center, and Racine Amos from the Women's Center. And all of the staff that works with them who have done that. Of course, Joanna and Fernando Guzman, who has done an amazing job in helping us to recruit and retain over 37 diverse faculty and staff members to the community. I see Amanda, who's representing the, I don't remember your last name, Amanda, but she's a graduate. Stand up, Amanda. Who's representing the Gender and Sexuality Center. Is there anybody else from CED who is here, who I didn't fail to acknowledge? Oh, yes, our students. Acknowledge yourself, Chantel and Saronica. And we're happy to have you as part of our CED team. In addition to all of the commissions, the President's Commission on LGBTQ, on women, on people of color, on folks with disabilities, we also want to acknowledge the Women of Color Network, Faculty Senate. In order for this to be a university-wide document, we had to go through a process of vetting this with the entire community from top to bottom. And Dr. Joanna Varell put the strategic plan draft on our website for almost half of the year, for a good part of the semester, so that people could respond electronically and give their feedback electronically, in addition to going to specific meetings. There's a representative from Alton Jones here. We vetted the plan with the folks in Alton Jones as well. The College of Professional Studies, the University College, the graduate schools, enrollment services, faculty and staff of the African diaspora, and the Council of Deans, to name a few. If I've forgotten anyone, I apologize. But I wanted to list the individuals who were part of this, because this was not a single person writing this. This was a community effort. So many of the goals and strategies, if you open up your strategic plan and look at it, you will see that there are 3 goals, one for recruitment, one for retention, and one for transformation of the university community, impacting our climate here. And many of those goals, folks in the provost office, in CED, enrollment services, I see certain faculty, Anne-Marie Vaccaro and a number of other folks have been working on these. These are not new concepts that we're just introducing into the university, but this is codifying this document that not just that subject matter experts or people who are charged with doing this work and leading these efforts can access, but this is for everyone to say, hey, if I'm thinking about valuing diversity and inclusion, this is a place for me to start. These are the people that I can consult with. And you're going to hear from Dr. Luke Wood, who I had the privilege of having dinner with, and I'm not going to spoil it, but it was one of the most amazing dinners I've ever had. We're looking forward to hearing from Eric Caldor and Anne-Marie Vaccaro and Kayan Murray Johnson. I don't know whether she's here yet, but I suggest you listen, because they will give you tips and advice and insight as to better how to infuse diversity and inclusion into the work that we do. So I can't stand up here and not kind of reference the current climate of our country. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but I can't help but reflect on the impact of recent policies regarding health care and how they adversely impact people with disabilities, and people with disabilities who may not have health care, who may suffer and who may die as a result of the policies and procedures. I can't stand here without referencing the fact that the leadership in this country can joke about the vice president of this country thinking that it's okay to hang gay people. I cannot leave this podium without reflecting on the fact that recently the FBI Counterterrorism Division has identified supposed new threats of Black identified extremist. And the climate that impacts in this country. I just can't leave here without us realizing that we are not isolated from the impact of what is happening on a national level. And this, for many, is as serious as life and death. So, as we are dealing with the impact of the incendiary behavior coming from our leadership, we need a plan. We need a strategic plan. We need a plan to counter much of the hateful rhetoric that is happening in this country. So we have the University of Rhode Island's Community, Equity, and Diversity Strategic Plan, a plan that will help us recruit a more diverse student population, faculty population, and staff population, and to give you guidance as to how to do it. So not just the folks sitting over here are charged with that work, but all of us can share in that responsibility. But we also need a plan for retention. Once we bring folks to this campus, to this beautiful campus, we have to think about how we can keep folks here. What are the things that make it attractive to people who are gay, people who are disabled, people who identify as many folks in the marginalized spectrum? So we need a plan, but we also need a plan to transform the university, because we can't stay where we are, and we can't let the current climate dictate the way we think. So I encourage you to embrace the speakers of the day, and stay tuned, because Luke Wood will be a treat. And at this point, I'm going to transition to Provost Don DeHaze, and hopefully he will share some words about the value of diversity and how folks in the Provost's office are already infusing diversity and inclusion into their work. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Congratulations to the Office of Community, Equity, and Diversity and officially launching today the new CED strategic plan. This is timely, important, and critical for the whole institution. Naomi thanked a lot of people, and I don't want to reiterate the long list, but I saw Joanna over the last year or two walking through the halls, sometimes looking frazzled. I know what it takes to put together a strategic plan that reflects not only your own opinions and values, but that of many, many people from throughout this institution. Joanna, you did yeoman's work, and thank you very much on behalf of the university for your leadership. Diversity at the University of Rhode Island doesn't belong to any one of us, it belongs to all of us. It's a responsibility. And as an institution, I think we need to, while we celebrate the rolling out of this plan, we need to think about what are our responsibilities moving forward. What are we going to do on this campus? We can reflect on the national distress that Naomi referred to. For that matter, the international challenges that hover over our nation right now and actually create levels of fear for many of us. But I would love to see us focus as explicitly as we can on what will we do about it. I'm so pleased that Dr. Wood is here, because he's going to hold us responsible not for the words in the plan, but for the actions that emerge from it. And I think he's going to talk to us about implementing the plan. I don't think in recent years the University of Rhode Island has created plans that sit on shelves. A lot of institutions have that history. And so we have momentum about saying a plan is a pathway forward. A plan is not a booklet on a shelf. And I hope everyone in this room, and many that are not here this morning, will take that seriously. the goals of this plan, I did read this line by line and went over it with Naomi and others. And so I guess, which is always good because you feel like a little bit of your own self is in the plan. And because this is really, really important for our university. So we all need to own a few of the words and a few of the ideas, if not all of them. And so I'm very, very excited about this. It's really well done. But the piece of this that's most important to me, I'll be selfish and talk about my own perspective here for a moment, is goal 3. Obviously, recruitment and retention are critically important, and we've been working hard at that, and I think we have some pretty good evidence of success over the last decade. But goal 3 is about values, and goal 3 is about organizational culture. Goal 3 is about what we will do, not about what somebody else will do, not about assigning a charge to the admissions office to do something, but it's about what all of us do. And some of you have heard me say this before, and I think, in taking Naomi's cue, there's probably never been a more important time in recent history for universities to step up and become the places where difficult conversations can happen. Actually, where difficult conversations must happen. So, and some of these conversations are difficult. When people with different perspectives, values, and experiences in the world live and work in the same community, we have to find ways to talk about those differences and to understand those differences. An old hero of mine, Václav Havel, used to talk about it's more important to spend time understanding than explaining. And I think universities need to be places where we come together as a community to understand each other, not just to argue for our perspective on what does it mean to be in a community, but we actually work to understand each other. So goal 3 is about creating that organizational culture that reflects our institutional values. And my guess is we will always be working on goal 3. You know, we might get to the point on goals 1 and 2 that we'll be satisfied with numbers in some way. But goal 3 is always going to be calling on our better selves to be more open to perspectives that we've never experienced before. So this launch today is the beginning. For Joanna, it may feel like the end of a step or an era, but it's simply the beginning. And what I'm most pleased with is really on the cover of this plan, and I love the complementary design. You know, design thinking is part of our academic aspirations these days, and maybe you can see that in the design of those 3 plans behind me. But on the cover it says, this is a campus-wide guide. Those 3 words, or is a hyphenated word count as 2? I don't remember, but I'll call it 3 words that matter. This is a campus-wide guide. This doesn't belong to Joanna or Naomi or CED. This is what all of us must do. I'm particularly pleased because it dovetails directly with the academic strategic plan. And that's not the chief academic officer speaking from a place of the academic mission is more important. The academic mission is why we are all here, which is why the president of the university has declared in no uncertain terms that the academic strategic plan is the University of Rhode Island strategic plan. And many other plans, whether it's athletics, CED, student affairs, et cetera, really support that. We come together as a community to create excellence and to create a community that matters, a community that we all are part of, and a community that we all want to be a part of. So today is the beginning of a new time. We do, in fact, need such a plan, and now we have one. So now the next step is implementation, and I'm pleased that Luke will give us some ideas later on how we might do that. Or maybe he'll just challenge us to make sure we do that. And so thank you for being here, Luke. We really appreciate that. And congratulations to everyone on campus for your effort in putting together a plan that will move the university forward.
Next, I just want to invite up one of the newest members of the senior leadership team and a valued colleague and friend, Dr. Kathy Collins, the Vice President of Student Affairs, and she goes without introduction. Yes.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. if you can please, I love certainly the clapping and celebration this morning, because I think this is an opportunity for celebration. So I certainly want to thank Naomi and her team for the work that you've done on this. This is critically important. I want to thank Joanna, having done strategic plans in the past. Thank you. It's, never enough in terms of the work that we do. I want to thank Eileen for your work in terms of supporting the team across the division. But enough has been said, I think, in terms of the work that we need to do as an institution to become more welcoming, to become more successful, to become the difference that we want to see in the world. Because our world is certainly hurting. I think of my colleagues this morning, what they're experiencing at the University of Florida. I think of my colleagues across the country that are experiencing different things at different institutions and wonder, when us? When will this happen to us? It already is, if people are not experiencing already some of the groups that are forming on our campus. I thought last year, when some of you reflected with me, they were surprised that 51 students attended the the College Republicans meeting, that we had college Republicans here. Of course, we do. When you think of over 40% of the state of Rhode Island voted for President Trump. When you think about just some of the things that are happening across our country, across our world, and again, I reflect on what's happening this morning at the University of Florida. If you're not familiar with that, Spencer's speaking there today. They've actually declared a state of emergency this morning in Florida. A state of emergency. If you saw the photos, if you have colleagues there or following the event on Twitter, the police forces and SWAT teams and others that are surrounding that campus this morning because a speaker has come to disrupt. A speaker has come to spew hate. But we as a public institution are a forum of ideas. We're a place where language matters. We're a place where space is important. So we have to think about our role as not only a public institution, but a land grant formed with the Morale Act in terms of being about access. But we as an institution have to transform ourselves to not just be about access, to be about success. And success means that learning and graduation is happening. So when we bring people into our institution, what does it mean if they do or do not walk across that stage with that piece of paper? It's not enough to welcome people to our institution. I feel welcomed. Thank you for welcoming me. What we need to do is transform, and I believe this plan does, to help us retain students, retain staff, because as the newest member to the state of Rhode Island, your beaches are lovely. It's not always the most welcoming environment. And believe it or not everyone wants to go to the beach. It may not be a place of celebration for some, though we put it prominently on our documents, welcome to the beach. If you are an individual who the beach is not welcoming or you choose not go there, we have to move beyond the beach. So I see this plan and other plans moving us beyond the beach. We're more than that. We're as an institution. I was just able to recruit a nationally known person in the field of housing, came here because social justice is one of our values, and they did not see that at other institutions. But will they see that when they get here? We have systemic issues that we must address as an institution. When I stand in the middle of campus and I see the flood of white women joining our Greek community, I've never seen that many white women in my life. It's quite scary to stand out there and see so many people. I celebrate the accomplishments of our Greek community, but the very fact that we don't have multicultural Greek units on this campus means we have failed. We, as an institution, are failing. So we have so much work to do. Last year, many of you in this room assisted me in doing a review of one of our most renowned programs in its 49th year, talent development. But I called to question that so many people in this room and around this university, alums and others, allowed that program to have a 6-year graduation rate of under 50%. Unacceptable. We are failing. So this plan and our institution moving forward through multiple plans, cascading up to each other to a common tapestry, will create that successful opportunity for us as an institution, for us as ed community. That word community means the world to me. As a first-gen person, as a lesbian woman who has incredible privilege based on the color of my skin and the fact that I'm slightly overeducated compared to the norm. If 1 in 10,000 people in the world have a PhD, how many of you in this room sit amongst that academic elite? So how do we move ourselves forward? I and the Division of Student Affairs want you to know that we support this plan. We strongly are working together with our colleagues, the leadership in CED, and I recognize the work we need to do in student affairs. Trust me. And we are doing that very work. So this is a university-wide plan, not one to sit on shelves, not one to simply collect dust, not one that will easily take the pages out of the binder and simply just put new pages in the next couple of years. So I thank you. I thank the academic mission of the institution. I thank all of us, because as we know in this room, many of us, next week our accreditors will be here. Having these types of documents is simply not going to be enough for accreditation. These words should be leaping off the page at you in regards to what work do we need to do. We have to live this every day. Because this is a tough place to live. This is a tough place to work. It's not always accepting. There's hate that's happening in our residence halls. There's hate that's happening in our classrooms. So we as an institution must do more. We must hold ourselves accountable. So I thank you for doing this hard work with me. Let's roll up our sleeves. Let's get to work. Let's recognize our own bias, our own discrimination, the oppression that we are practicing on this campus every day. So thank you for doing the hard work with me. Know that my staff is committed to this. We will do this work, and I will personally be holding them accountable. So thank you for being a part of this. I wish this room was full, but you know what? We have to start somewhere, and I'm glad some people are in class today. So thank you for doing this. Thank you for the work of CED, and I look forward to all that lies ahead. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for being here. When we were talking about a launch date and creating the strategic plan, Joanna and Naomi and I got together, put our heads together and said, who out there would we like to invite that could address the strategic plan, address the issues of recruitment, retention, climate, that is both a scholar, researcher, and practitioner. I believe it was Joanna that came up with the name about Luke Wood. She mentioned Luke Wood, and I said, you know what? I know him. Would you mind if I call him? I called him. Luke, how you doing? How's the family? How are things going? This is what we're going to do here at the University of Rhode Island. Would you be interested in coming out to a keynote address? His response was, when do you want me there? I met Luke when he was a doctoral student at Arizona State University, when I was working at another university as a recruiter doing something very similar to the work that I'm doing here. Contacted a distinguished professor by the name of Caroline Turner that was at Arizona State University, and I said, look, I am looking at promising scholars of color who are interested in becoming faculty members in the academy and making change. She goes, you just want one? I said, well, who do you have? She goes, I have two individuals. One was Luke Wood. The other was Idara Wood, his wife. Both came to the Summer Institute. Amazing scholars, amazing individuals. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Luke Wood. He got both his bachelor's degree and his master's degree from Cal State Sacramento. Went on to Arizona State University, where he earned his doctorate. He is presently at the California State University, San Diego, It's a gorgeous location, not a bad place to be. Where his focus around his research is really on primarily men of color, in particular looking at black men of color and looking at the factors that contribute to their success, as well as looking at challenges and obstacles, and they're looking at persistence and graduation. He has over 70 publications. And last night talking to him, and I thought, well, I have 5 co-authored books, 5 edited books. He's like, oh, no, I just finished another 1 or 2. So I'm going to say roughly 10 books that he's written. Recently, Dr. Wood was recognized as the Dean's Distinguished Professor in the College of Education at San Diego State University, where he also serves as a director of the Joint Doctoral Program in Education between San Diego State University and Claremont Graduate University, and is also the director of the doctoral program in community college leadership. That's a snapshot of the work that he has done. And he's a true believer, and not only around the scholarship and doing the research, but a true practitioner in a lot of the work that he has done nationally and internationally. One of his most recent projects is the Black Minds Matter that he has, as we were talking last night, about, I think it was 10,000, reaching 10,000 individuals across the country that are involved with that, making a huge difference. So at this point, please join me in welcoming Dr. Luke Wood.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I truly appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm going to just use this mic instead. It's really a privilege to have the opportunity to help the campus in this launch of a very important plan. I'd like to thank a few people before I begin. Your Provost, Donald DeHaze, Associate Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer, Naomi Thompson, who I had a wonderful evening with last night, Dr. Fernando Guzman, Director of Diverse Faculty and Staff Recruitment, and then also my colleague, Anne-Marie. Good to see you. I haven't had a chance to connect with you yet, but it's good to see you. So I have some comments for you that I think will help as the campus moves forward in enacting this plan. But I should probably first pull up my PowerPoint. It's up, but it's not necessarily advancing. Could you? Yeah.
Is it not going through? Just try it like this.
Cool. Thank you. All right, here we go. So thank you. So the title of my talk is Beyond the Plan, Implementing Equity Efforts Across the Community in a Climate of Resistance. And the title of this talk really emerged from the work that me and my colleagues have been doing in California. And in our state, the legislature passed a law that basically put into place that all the campuses were to do equity plans. And what those equity plans were is that they were supposed to identify groups that were experiencing disproportionate impact. So using outcomes data, look at students who were look at student success rates and then look at students who fell below those success rates. So identifying those who experienced that disproportionate impact, and then to create plans to help essentially bridge that gap. Now, all the campuses in the past couple of years have been engaged in planning, been engaged in interventions, but it's actually not the first time that they've done these plans. In fact, they did the plans many years ago. And for many of the campuses, when they came back around time again to do it, they had to then go find, okay, well, where is our plan? So, because we need to have some sort of starting point to figure out what we're doing. So they went down into their archives and they picked up the plans and they blew the dust off of them. In some cases, that's literal. Some cases, not so. So basically, trying to figure out, okay, so what are we going to do? So they start out with these plans, and we've worked with probably 50 of the colleges in California in terms of implementing their plans. And in addition to that, at San Diego State, I also teach a course, strategic planning. So this is kind of up my alley in terms of talking about this. But one of the things that we learned from the work, both in doing that and in teaching the course, is that there's always resistance to any type of change. And especially when we're talking about issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, there's even more resistance. And it makes it even more difficult when, of course, we have a national climate where things are not even subtle anymore, they're overt. And we then have to figure out, how do we move forward in an agenda in an overt environment where people feel empowered to demonstrate bigotry and supremacy. So recognizing that, I want to talk about what this looks like in a climate of resistance. So in terms of the center that I run, it's called the Community College Equity Assessment Lab. And what we do is we partner primarily with community colleges, though I'm a education researcher, so I do work from preschool to doctoral level education. Though a lot of the work that I do focuses on community colleges, primarily because if we're talking about students of color, first-generation students, low-income students, the primary place that they're located at is a community college. So if we want to start out with real diversity and equity conversations, that's certainly a place to do it. And so we basically collect data at community colleges, and then we help use that data to inform their planning processes as it relates to equity, as it relates to strategic planning. And we then help campuses then use that data to try to bridge the gap. And in reality, some campuses have been successful in doing that and some campuses haven't. And so what I wanted to talk about were just some of the things that we've seen as pitfalls of that. What are some of these kind of recurrent patterns of resistance? And I think some of them may resonate with you. Some of the examples may not. And I think that that's okay. I think it'll help us to think about, what do we need to do to be prepared to engage this effort on this campus? So one of the things that I do, it actually doesn't show up here. So I'm just going to do, I'm going to step over here. So one of the things that I do is, well, that's not going to work, is it? There we go. So one of the things that I do is I run a consortium, and it's part of our center. It's called the National Consortium on College Men of Color. And what we do with the consortium is we partner with community colleges across the country, and we help them to build their capacity to better serve men of color. So we're looking at primarily Black, Latino, Southeast Asian, Native American, and Pacific Islander men as part of the work that we do. Though a lot of my work focuses on Black males, our center has 22 people who are part of the center that I run, or co-direct rather, with Frank Harris, and we have different focuses in terms of the work that we do. So as part of the consortium, we learned a lot about what it takes to help move campuses in this direction. So we have 132 members that are part of our consortium that tune in once a month to monthly webinars that we do on strategic planning, on using assessment to guide interventions, on designing programs and services for underserved students. So a litany of different topics that we do. And we do that in partnership with a number of national organizations that are reputable in terms of helping to advance these kind of issues on college campuses. In addition to that, we also then, as I mentioned, collect data at a number of different colleges. So we have a number of different instruments. One is called our Community College Success Measure, and basically it's an in-class instrument, and we participate with campuses. We take the instrument, we distribute it in randomly selected course sections, and then students complete the instrument, and then they send it back to us, and then we use that to create a report for the campus. Now, this is important because oftentimes, I saw that in the report there was a lot about, or in the plan, there's a lot about collecting data, right? Good data in, right? Good data out. We're going to be able to do a lot with it. And unfortunately, a lot of the work that focuses on underserved students uses online surveys or survey methodologies that don't help to get at the population that you're trying to look at. For example, I do a lot of work on food and housing insecurity, and if I do an online survey, I know that I'm probably going to either get a huge representation of those students who are experiencing it, depending upon how I advertise it, or I'm going to get a significant underrepresentation because there might be lack of access to be able to have, to be able to respond to a survey of that nature. So we have to think about these things as we unveil these plans. So this is just to kind of give a little bit of background about the work that we do in partnering with colleges across the country to really engage and implement plans of this nature. So I think that it's important for us to begin with a more kind of base level conversation, which is, do we think that this plan is something that we should even do? I read through the plan a couple times now, and I think it's excellent. It highlights recruitment, highlights retention, highlights transforming the community, but I'm an external person. So if the individuals on this campus don't pick this up and it doesn't resonate with them as this is something that we should be doing, that this is something I'm going to stand for, that this is something that I'm going to advocate for, it doesn't go anywhere. It's going to be like the plans in California from years ago where we're going to come back 10 years from now. We'll have a really awesome celebration like this again, and we'll blow off the old plans and try to pick up from where we left off. So if we really want to make that kind of meaningful change, we're going to have to really buy into the idea that equity and diversity are important. And I think, judging by the representation of people in this room, judging by just some of the brief conversations that I had, this is probably a room full of people who do believe in this plan. And some of you might be saying to yourself, gosh, I wish so-and-so was here. That's not uncommon. We're going to talk about that. But if we're going to do this kind of work, we have to think about, okay, so what is the reason that we're doing it? Well, usually we start out with the more kind of like important things about, producing numbers of students, and it's important to have diversity because it helps us reach these numbers. I don't start there. I think I start with the ethical, because it's usually the last thing we argue, because for some people it's a weaker argument. But if we really are interested in equity and diversity, it has to be because we want to create a more just world. Because we recognize that there are certain groups that are systematically prevented from being able to be part of this campus. Either they're systematically prevented from being able to come in, or they're systematically excluded from the social environment, or from feeling a sense of belonging. And so that's important for us to keep in mind. If we really are about this, then we have to commit to increasing student achievement and completion. Equity efforts help us do that. Identifying where the gaps are, using inquiry to inform our interventions, and then engaging that's what this is about. Increasing our retention of diverse faculty, preparing our students for a diverse global marketplace, preparing students to be better actors in an imperfect world. I think the context that was laid in terms of the national bully pulpit, in terms of how that's being used in negative ways, in terms of what we've seen in Charlottesville and Florida and so many other places, right? If we are truly committed to diversity and inclusion, we have to be cognizant that there are some real pressing concerns that are facing us right now that require us to do so. All right, so what I thought I'd do was start with some of your own data. So just to help provide a context as to why we should be having this discussion. So this is fall 2016 representation of faculty here on this campus. And this is public information. It's on your fact sheet for the institution. So I didn't make these numbers up. This is what the institution is reporting. So yeah, the total number of faculty across ethnic distributions, as you can see there on the top. And then the total percentage that they represent. So for example, 79% of the faculty on campus are Caucasian or white. 3.3% are black. And then what you have at the bottom of the screen is the representation in the state based upon the most recent census data. So as a person who does equity work, one of the things that we try to think about in terms of how do we know that we have good representation of faculty and staff in terms of diversity is we have what's called a proportional representation ratio, where typically we take the demographic region that the college tends to serve, and then with this being a state institution, it makes sense to look at the state. And then we compare that against the distribution of faculty or staff or administrators, and we use that to make general statements about how are we doing. Well, highlighted down below at the bottom, you can see what it is for the state, and then you can see what it is there on top. So you can see that there are some groups that are above the representation for the state, and there are some groups that are pretty significantly below. One group that stands out to me, partially being African American, is that 8.1% of the state are African Americans and 3.3% of the faculty are. Seems like an imbalance, right? Seems like something that we should be attentive to. So when we look at this and we see these gaps, then what is equity? Equity is saying, okay, here are the gaps. Now we have a plan that tells us we need to do something about it and gives us a guiding framework for doing that. Now let's put in interventions to bridge that gap. But we can only do so, again, going back to the original point, if we truly believe that this is important for us to do. Let's look further at the undergraduate distribution in comparison to the state. So here's the undergraduate distribution, total numbers of students, total percentage of students. You can see some differences here, and then you can see that there is one group, the other not specified, that's basically higher than the percentage, and then some lower percentages, and some groups tend to stand out. Now, here's one thing that I found to be really important in keeping this data here in mind, is that because of the smaller percentages of students of color on the campus, we're talking about incredible percentages that there are differences. For example, look at our Native American students, right? We're on their land, right? And there's 32 total undergraduates that are represented in this, representing 0.2% of the population. It wouldn't take, if we were to simply double that rate, think about how meaningful that would be. So I think one of the good things about seeing your own data is it helps you to say, okay, well, how many people are we really talking about? And you know what? To say, hey, we need to increase it a certain percentage, that's hard for people to wrap their minds around. When you say, you know what? We all need to be responsible for recruiting this many more students or retaining this many more students, it becomes a different argument, right? It becomes something that's a little bit more realistic for us to do. All right, let's go a little bit further here. And this is kind of more my sweet spot in terms of the work I do. Most of my work focuses on student equity, right? What does it take for students to be successful? So it's nice to look at the data and look at what was reported to IPEDS, right? So this is the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System. We're looking at 150% of normal time. So four-year institution, 6-year graduation rate, that's 150% of normal time. So in 6 years, the overall rate, according to Student Right to Know, is 63%, right? Based upon the most recent data that's reported on the federal government website, all right? Now, what you can see is that for women on campus, and just so you know how the feds report this, they do men, they do women, they do not do well with any other population. So as a result, what does that mean? That we have populations that are systematically excluded from this data and therefore become insignificant and not part of the conversation in ways that is only serve to reify the oppression that they face. That's a whole other argument for another time, but it's important for us to keep in mind. So if we look at women, right, 67% are completing, right, in that time frame. And then you can look at the graduation rates across ethnic groups. What stands out to you? Anybody? Anything stand out? Well, it's okay because I highlighted the groups that stand out. All right, so we can see that while it's 67% for the campus, look at the success rate for Hispanic women and black women. It's much lower than that, right? That's an equity gap. We have to be doing something about that. We have to recognize that that's an issue, right? So equity really means what? Looking at the data and then being committed to doing something about it. So are we committed? I think this room is. But we're going to talk about exactly what that looks like. So men, let's look at men, and I'm just going to go fast forward what groups stand out to you. I see the group that I do my research on. I do research on black boys and men. In fact, if you look overall at the groups that are in red, those are the groups that are falling below their respective sex or gender averages. It says something, right? It says that there is a problem. Now, some people see this data and they rationalize it in different ways. For me, I come from a systems perspective. I believe that every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. So if we see disparities and outcomes that look like this, we can rationalize it in different ways, but the best way to rationalize it is, hey, there's something wrong with what we're doing. The equity efforts that we've put into place thus far have not been successful. And it's about being honest and calling it out. You know what? We haven't been as successful as we would like to be, and now we have a plan that's going to help us get there. And that's important. And let me give you an example of how we sometimes have systems that only serve to reify the current patterns that we have. So it's not uncommon for me to go to a college and do a lot of work in terms of like, okay, how do we hire diverse faculty, right? How do we hire faculty, even beyond that? Let's not even get into diverse faculty. How do we hire faculty who are committed to diversity? And on most campuses, if there's a hiring committee, right, there's people who sit on a table and they're interviewing a prospective candidate, whether this is for a faculty job or for student services or whatever it might be. And it says, tell me if this sounds familiar. Can you tell me about your experiences in working with diverse student populations? Does it sound pretty familiar? Okay. So here's the deal. That question only tells us about someone's exposure to diversity, not their commitment to diversity. And those are two very different things. Sometimes we have things in place that we think, hey, this is designed to help us reach a point that we want to be, but we have questions that don't even help us to reach that. We have questions that give us something else. Because a lot of people can tell you, oh yeah, well, I went to this diverse school and I worked with this diverse group of people and I did this thing. But that doesn't tell you about commitment. That doesn't tell you how they change their teaching practices to accommodate the needs of diverse learners, or how they use multicultural counseling techniques, or how they do anything different in terms of their practice to ensure that they're reaching the population that they want to reach. So those are two very different things. And so we create these structures, right? These social structures, these campus structures that only serve to reify the patterns that we already see. And that's why the emphasis in the report on getting into inquiry, getting into data, recognizing that there's something that we need to do, that's why that's so important. It's because it's going to help us move past where we're at. Now, again, some people see that data, right? Let's go back to this. I mean, this is pretty damning. And just so you know, like, this is the same pattern we see in most places, right? So this isn't Rhode Island. This is America. But we can't be satisfied with what this is, right? So some people see this and as educators, we're taught through educational theories to rationalize things as being very specific to students. If you look at the primary theories in education, integration, involvement, engagement, they're theories that basically look at the degree to which a student is engaging, a degree to which a student is contributing. In fact, a lot of them are rooted in a concept called PACE's quality of student effort, which suggests that the student who is most committed, placing the most effort in their studies, that's the student who's going to be successful. And yeah, is that true to an extent? Absolutely. But in the work that I do, I find that success, commitment, self-efficacy, resilience, focus in school, all these important concepts are typically a function of the environment that they're in. If they're in an environment that's inclusive, an environment that's affirming, an environment where they're receiving validation, they're going to be more likely to be successful. But as an educator, because we've been educated through typically these traditional lenses of seeing students, what we do is what? We start to rationalize when we don't see students doing well, and we've probably heard colleagues say things to this effect. What the heck is wrong with these students? Why aren't they doing what it takes for them to be successful here? Now, I'm not going to ask any of you if you've ever said that yourselves, because I'm sure some of us have said that ourselves in a moment of weakness. But how many of you have ever heard, either at this institution or any other institution that you've worked at throughout your career, someone say something to this effect? All right. Almost every hand went up in the room. Again, we shouldn't be surprised because that's the primary way of rationalizing these things. But ultimately, this doesn't produce anything. What can I do with this? What kind of program, what kind of policy, what kind of practice is this going to do? You know what it's going to do? It's going to create programs to fix students. And if we want to get to institutional transformation, it's not about fixing students. It's about fixing ourselves and our institution. And so then we transition to what we would view as a more equity-minded frame, asking ourselves, what are we doing as a university, as a college, as a department, that's resulting in our students not doing as well as they should? And it's only when we start to do that that we can really make a meaningful change. But it's interesting how we as educators will shift things. So sometimes I'll present this and I'll talk at like one of our partner colleges, right? And I'll say, this is really important. We have to have this mindset because that's going to help us get to the next point. And they're like, yeah, you're right. You know, there is something going wrong here. And you know what, you're right. Every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results it gets. So you know what? Can you tell those folks at the district office that they really need to change what they're doing? And I'm like, no, you're missing the point. Every system, every university, every college, every department, every classroom, every office is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. So it's only when we bring it down to that personal level that we're actually able to make the changes that we ultimately want to see. So this goes back to a concept by one of our colleagues, Dr. Stella Ben-Simone, who talks about funds of knowledge. And from an equity-minded perspective, it's as equity-minded educators, we have to basically take accountability for the issues that we see, right? It's bringing it and personalizing that. And here's the interesting thing. I do a survey. One of the surveys is called a Community College Instructional Development Inventory. And what we do is we model when people have an equity-minded perspective where they basically say, hey, if students aren't doing well, I take that as the fact that I'm not doing well, right? And if they are succeeding, I take that as a fact that I'm succeeding, right? And when they start to personalize it, what we find is that they're more likely to use just about every single practice that we know is important for student success. So it's a mindset that ends up changing practice. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind. One of the things, and I want to point this out because, again, the report and the strategic plan is that oftentimes what we do, and oftentimes what I see as a failure at many institutions, is we do what looks good. We do what's shiny, right? And my institution's no different. We have a mentoring program. We're going to say every student who comes in who's African American, they're going to get a mentor. Can't tell you if the program's successful. The data's not released, right? It's not necessarily a climate of transparency because you know what the issue is? We have to get further and down deeper. What we do is we typically, as a colleague says, we typically shift sand. We throw all these interventions out that look good, that sound good, but we never get to the bedrock. And the bedrock is typically our culture. A culture that is rooted in racism, rooted in bigotry. Now, let me back up a little bit. Does that mean that educators are bad people? I would say this, and this is my own perspective, that being biased doesn't make you bad. It makes you human. If you're raised in the United States, you can't be a person who doesn't have bias. right? That's just impossible. But choosing to do nothing about it, that's what's bad. And so it's about, again, taking that responsibility for what we want to see. I'm going to skip to I'm going to go past this, because I want to get to this, and I'm going to go back to some of these things. Because I think it's important to provide a little bit of context as to some of the work that we've done. So as part of my external life from SDSU, I run a center. It's called the Center for Organizational Responsibility and Advancement. What we do are online training programs for colleges that focus on better supporting and teaching men of color. So we have programs that prepare K-12 teachers to work with men of color, boys of color rather. We have programs for college educators that tell them, okay, here's some strategies and practices that work with teaching, student services. So we have all these programs focused on better preparing educators, capacity building for men of color. And as part of rolling out those programs with campuses, we learned some things that I think is absolutely essential as you think about this plan. So typically, when I'm invited to come do a speech, and I do a lot of speaking on unconscious bias and a lot of speaking on microaggressions. Those are kind of the two things I do probably most often. And by the way, it's not unconscious anymore, and it's not microaggressive anymore. It's very overt and it's very out in your face. But that's, again, another conversation for another time. But what I've learned is that when they invite me to come in, typically it's like for a brown bag or an optional program, and anybody who wants to come, they should just, come through. And, the person who put it in mind is really committed to equity, and they're really committed to diversity, and they're so happy they're going to have a person who comes in from the outside, and we're going to change the things that are going on. And then people start showing up, and they start seeing faces that they recognize, and they start realizing pretty quickly that, you know what, the people are here are the people who are already doing the right things. And the person who I had in mind when I created this workshop on microaggressions, they're not here. Probably no different than a launch for a strategic plan focused on community, equity, and diversity. But I'm going to tell you this, that's okay. Because we have essentially a process map that we think helps to work in terms of then moving forward with what is this next step beyond that. So first of all, it entails recognizing that there are different populations. So, and what we have done is we've created this taxonomy of educators' perspectives that we use in rolling out that program on many campuses that I think is perfectly parallel to rolling out a strategic plan for community, equity, and diversity. So basically, it's broken down into two characteristics: educators who know what to do and educators who have a willingness to do it. So, and then there's basically those two characteristics are broken out into different categories. You've probably seen charts that look similar to this. And in the top right-hand side is like the ultimate person that we want to see. It's probably representative of the vast majority of people in this room. These are people who know what to do and have a willingness to employ those practices. What do you think we call those individuals? They have a willingness to do it, they know what to do, and they have a willingness to do it. You said the choir? Okay. So usually people say advocates, champions. Some people jokingly say unicorns because you can never find them. So we see different things, but actually you are right, it is the choir. Right? It's the choir. The choir knows what to do. And they have a willingness to do it. So if there is a voluntary meeting about the launch of a strategic plan for diversity, typically the people who are going to show up are the people who are members of the choir. And that's okay. Because it's important for the choir to coalesce. It's important for the choir to have conversations. It's important for the choir to strategize together, as long as that is merely a starting point. Now, oftentimes when I do these presentations on microaggressions, it's the choir that shows up. But then I get maybe a couple other people who are members of another group, which we call the allies. The allies are people who are passionate about these issues. They want to support these issues, but they don't necessarily know what to do. They don't necessarily know what their role is in that. They don't know necessarily the strategies and practices that work
for supporting underserved populations, but they're committed to the idea of it, right? So the bridge, essentially, between those who are members of the allies and members of the choir is knowledge. It's information. And that's something we can do. So typically what we recommend is this. If you're having a launch of a plan like this should be the first meeting. And then at the end of this meeting, everyone on the way out the door should write down the names of 3 individuals who they know are allies. People who would support these efforts, who would support these issues, but may need an additional level of encouragement to be here the next time. Right? And then when they come and they learn the information and they get the information and they feel more empowered, guess what we're going to do after the end of that next meeting? We're going to ask them to do what? Write down the names of some other individuals, right? So we start building momentum. And that's how to really engage plans like this. Now, there's another group that you might be familiar with, is the title of the presentation. It's the resistors. So those are people who don't know what to do, and it doesn't really matter because they don't have a willingness to do it anyhow. Now, there's 2 different types of resistors that we see. There are active resistors and passive resistors. And it's really clear the difference between the two. Active resistors actively resist. When they hear that either myself or Frank are coming to the campus to talk about typically our work on men of color, they're the individual that shoots off an email across campus and CCs everyone on campus and says, you know what, why are we doing this? This is reverse racism. Why are we talking about fill in the blank group? We should be talking about fill in the blank other group instead. And these are individuals that when they hear that we're doing a training on microaggressions, and they don't really want to go, so maybe they're a department chair, and so they hold a mandatory faculty meeting, not only so that they don't have to go, but so that they can prevent others from going. Active resistors actively resist. And you know what? Here's the thing. They're visible, they're vocal, but they typically represent a much smaller group than we give them, than we recognize. And typically it's because they're so vocal. Now, there's another group that's also resistors, and we call them passive resistors. Passive resistors, they passively resist. They just kind of want to stay out of the fray. They hear that, hey, there's a meeting going on to establish a new strategic plan for diversity and equity, and they're like, well, that's not really my thing, right? I don't really want to do that. They might even say to themselves, might even want to believe to themselves, well, yeah, I support that. Yeah, they should do that. I mean, I'm not going to go, but they should do that. And so we see a lot of passive resistors, right? They want to stay out of it. So they're not going to say they're not going to go. They're not going to say they're not going to support it. They're just going to vote. You know how they vote? With their presence, with their feet. Then there's another group, the last group, which is what we call the defiant. The defiant are those who actually know what to do. They know how to support underserved students. They know how to advocate for issues. They might have training and organizational change and strategic planning. They might not know how to do these things, but they choose not to. It's a willing choice. They choose not to do so. And there's a couple different groups that we see fall into that. Sometimes you have people who are part of the choir who've been burnt. And they're just, I just can't do it anymore. This isn't something for me anymore. And we see that, but that's a lesser percentage. Typically what it is are individuals who they want to advocate for the students who they're close with, but they're not going to choose to do that for other students. And typically the difference between those things is either racial dynamics or gender dynamics or sexual orientation dynamics or wherever it might be, right? So it's another group that we have to keep in mind. So this is a percentage breakdown when we do with the work with the colleges that we find in general, right? And I've kind of rounded them up just to make them a little bit easier to digest. But essentially, typically you got 15% of people who are members of the choir. And then you've got about 30% of the people who are allies. Now, we put those two groups together, we got something going. Now, if you remember, the first group of the resistors was the active resistors. They typically represent about 10% of a population, but dang, they are a vocal 10, right? But they will be active. Heck, they help get presidents elected. right? And then there are 30%, right, who are these passive resistors, right, who are a little bit more careful. They don't really want to engage, and then about another 15% that are defiant. And so what we want to do is help to move people up into being members of the choir. So here's a process that we use with the colleges that we partner with. We call it the 3 E's: empower, educate, and encourage. So with the choir, our goal is to empower them. Empower them with strategies and practices and resources and tools to do the work that they're already doing, but to do it even better. Now, does that mean that they don't need additional training, that they don't need additional insights, they don't need additional resources? Of course they do, right? So that's important, right? So that's why meetings like this are important, because they help to coalesce the choir. And if there's a meeting like this, you know, if you're going to have a meeting that helps to bring people together to further move forward this agenda, right, you can send them an email. You can post a flyer. And guess what? The choir, they're going to be there. We've done trainings on microaggressions, unconscious bias at lunchtime. People come voluntarily at lunch. And in the evening, we did Saturday programs. People come down on their Saturday. Why? Because when they're committed to these issues, it doesn't matter when it takes place, right? Equity doesn't rest. Now, with the allies, it's a little bit different, right? They're committed to, you know, general principles of equity, general principles of social justice, but they may not be as passionate about some of the groups that are going to come out as being our real target groups based upon disproportionate impact, right? So, hey, you know, I'm down with, you know, underserved students, but, you know, black women really aren't my thing. Or, you know, and so you'll see that. And again, a lot of the difference in the bridging there is they simply just don't know what to do. It's not that they don't care, they just don't know what that looks like. So with the members of those allies, we need to reach out to them, but to be a little bit more hands-on. And so what we do is we have, again, that snowball thing I said, where you write down names and you coalesce people. And then what you do is like follow-up emails to them. Hey, we're going to have a meeting. Can you please be there? And maybe a phone call. Because you know what? They'll probably come, but you need to be just a little bit more hands-on with them. So voluntary, but convenient. Then, remember, there are 2 different types of resistors. There's active resistors, and what's the other one? Passive resistors. So with passive resistors, our job isn't to empower them. Our job isn't to educate them. It's to encourage them. And you might be asking, to encourage them to what? Encourage them to care. And the way that we believe that you encourage them to care is through showing them the problem. And oftentimes that includes data. That's the reason that I do what I do. Campus-based assessments, quantitative data, qualitative data. And you have to have both, right? I find in the work that I do, if I go, and so typically with the team, I'm a quantitative researcher. My colleague Frank is a qualitative researcher. If he presents only his data, all the quant folks in the room are going to be like, well, wait a second. I mean, that's just what some people said. I mean, I don't know what they really think. And then if I just present my data, the quant data, people say, but I want to hear what do people say, right? So you got to do both. But here's something interesting that I've learned. As you think about how we get people on board, we learned something really interesting. One time we were doing a presentation, we were presenting the feedback of a report that we had done for a college. We were presenting quantitative data, we were presenting qualitative data, and then there were some students who were in the room. And we were talking about some of the challenges that were emerging from the data. And of course, you're going to have some people whose hands go up. The active resistors, well, how did you sample that? And I love talking about that, because as a researcher, I'm like, great, that's like up my alley. Yeah, we can talk about that all day, right? How did you employ the weight? So I can tell you how we weighted it. I can tell you the different models that we ran. I can tell you all those things, right? But it's another thing for then a student to say, but wait, I experienced that yesterday. And it changes the entire dynamic of a room, right? Because I think that most educators are good-hearted, caring people. They just don't know necessarily what to do. And oftentimes, because of privilege, they're simply oblivious to the challenges. And so it's about showing them that reality. And in particular with the report as it relates to the parts about students, in terms of recruiting, retaining, and transforming, it's going to require showing people a reality that they may not even be familiar with, that they may have a hard time wrapping their mind around. So with them, if you're going to reach the resistors, having an optional program, it's not going to happen. The passive resistors aren't going to come because they're going to vote with their feet. They're not going to be present. So you know what you do to reach the passive resistors? You go to mandatory places and spaces that they're already going to be. You know what that includes? Department meetings, convocation, all faculty days. Every campus, they got different names in different places, but there's typically a set of mandatory meetings or nearly mandatory meetings, right, that people go to. And if that's where we know we need to reach people, then that's where we have to go. I'm partnering with a college right now in California. I can't say which one because we keep our partner college relationships with them very private because this work is political. And there's a partner college that we were doing a year-long series of training on unconscious bias and microaggressions. And we held, I think, maybe 10 different sessions. And the choir came. And then it kind of worked. We had some allies who came. And we started building up a larger base of people. And then we started recognizing that, okay, we've reached a point where we're not going to get anyone new. And so the campus president says, there it goes, back on. So the campus president says, you know what? I saw that chart that you all did about being intrusive. Can we try something different? I was like, yeah, what are you thinking? She says, I want you to go to the division meetings. And so now this year, every division meeting for every single college, we're doing unconscious bias and microaggression trainings in their meetings. So instead of talking about the normal things that we talk about, they're there for an hour and a half, and they show up like, what are we doing today? What is this? And you can see people like, oh, heck no, they set me up. Right? We didn't set you up. We were strategic. I think this is going out, so I'm going to put it towards the podium. So if you want to reach them, you have to reach them in the places and spaces that they're already going to be. And so you want to be intrusive, but you also have to recognize that the motivation is different. Did you notice that there's different motivations across groups? So some groups, it's an intrinsic commitment. Some groups, it's social justice and educational equity. Some groups, it's something totally different, right? With those who are the passive resistors, it's about tangible things that they can see and they can feel. Organizational funding, priority, retention, tenure, promotion, release time, things that they can hold their hands onto. And we do that as a carrot to get them to care, and then we can hopefully move them to members of the allies and then members of the choir. Now, there's two other groups that I didn't mention yet, and that's the active resistors and the members of the defiant. You might be asking yourself, okay, so what do we do with them? And there's some things that we have to do with them. So some people have jokingly said, well, this should really be the 4 E's. Empower, educate, encourage, and eliminate. Or exit. Someone said exit, right? And I say, well, you know, that's not true either. Because you know what? I believe that everybody has the potential to contribute to this. And if we get to the point where we start writing people off, then we're only doing to them what we don't like done to us. And so what we have to do is recognize that they have value. Now, what I believe is created a campus climate and culture where they have to come to the realization, okay, I got to get on board with this. So if we can get all the members of the choir, all the members of the allies, all the members of the passive resistors to that point, we've created a culture where it's basically difficult for them to continue to be active resistors and to continue to be members of the defiant. So what we talk about doing is redirecting. If there's a way that they can contribute to the campus mission meaningfully, let's give them the time and space to be able to do that, recognizing that we're not leaving them alone. We're creating a culture where they're going to eventually come on board. Okay, so I think that it has to be important for us in terms of thinking about our role in this part of the work. So what I want to do is conclude, since I have some time still. I think I do, right? 10 minutes? Or I talk long, so I'm a professor.
You got it? Yeah, 10. Okay. So what I wanted to do is actually conclude with some examples of what we've seen that has not necessarily, that has been some of the equity issues that have been created in trying to address this work. So basically, campuses that we partner with, what are some of the breakdowns that they experience? So we have what we call our 6 domains of institutional responsibility or institutional equity. They include policies. So policies are principles of action that are ratified by the institution to govern programs, matriculation, course delivery, and resource allocation. They're attitudes and dispositions, the way a person thinks and feels about a particular situation or group of people. They are politics and power dynamics, relationships and interactions between units and actors. They're the structures, the way that we have structured our institution. They're parts of our institutional culture. And then there are data practices, right? So those 6 domains are things that we need to keep in mind. So what I was going to do is just share some of the breakdowns that we've seen in partnering with campuses. So the first one that you see, and I know you're not supposed to turn your back to the audience, but it's not lining up right now. So the first one that you see here and it's freezing. Okay, that's all right. So I'm just going to go with it and read you some of the examples, okay? So first area is policies. So sometimes we have institutional policies that prevent us from being able to do the work that we'd like to do. There's policies that prevent us. Now, there can be 2 different types of ways in which that plays out. One is we have a policy that's going to inhibit this, or that people are going to use to inhibit it, or we simply don't have a policy. And as a result, then can be that manifestation of, well, you can't make me do that. And those are real. So some of the things we see in terms of partnering with campuses is we recognize that oftentimes one of the primary things that educators need to do if they're going to better serve underserved student communities is engage in some major professional development. Most people who are educators are not taught to teach. They're subject matter experts. I'm going to go further. I teach in a college of education. No one has ever sat down and taught me how to teach. I can tell you all kinds of things about educational theory and learning and development. So if that's what it's like for a person who teaches in a college of ed, it's probably even worse for a person who's in College of Sciences or Health and Human Services, right? So a lot of the work that I do, again, is with community colleges. Let me tell you how a person becomes a faculty member in a community college, typically. They get a bachelor's degree in biology, they go and they work in industry for a couple of years, and then they get done with that. And once they're done with that, they go and they get a master's degree, and then they go into the classroom. They go into the classroom. And they don't necessarily know how to teach. Maybe there's a 1-week training program that they get, let's get them up and running, and we'll give them some really quick program. And then what happens is, what they do is they have to pull from something. So they teach typically how they were taught. And how they were taught is not how our students of color learn. There's a disconnect. There's no cultural relevance, typically no emphasis on relationship building, typically no emphasis on collaborative teaching and learning practices. So all the things that we know are important. So it's not uncommon for us to see a campus that doesn't have a policy that either requires people to participate in professional development, or on the flip side, there is a policy that requires people to participate in some sort of professional development, but the people who would typically teach our most underserved students are not required to participate in that, maybe because they're part-timers, right? It's not uncommon for people on some campuses not to be required to have office hours. That can be problematic if we know that for reaching these population, we have to have some sort of meaningful engagement with them. So we can have policies. We can have attitudes and dispositions. This is the second category. So oftentimes what that deals with are essentially deficit-oriented perspectives. These students aren't prepared. They're not serious. They're not committed. They're not focused. Right? That's a barrier that we might see. Here's another one, and this is one that we see pretty often. The English department refuses to participate in the equity discussion, right? They have the strategic plan, and this is an example of, I'm not saying the English department here, it's just an example, okay? And they feel like equity means, anyone ever heard this before? That equity means lowering standards by making it easier for students to pass classes. Equity doesn't mean lowering standards, it means raising standards. But from an institutional responsibility perspective, that's raising standards on us. Or maybe here's another one. I'm not sure what you expect me to do. These students have too much drama in their lives. I'm a faculty member, not a social worker. These are actual quotes, by the way, from some of the work that we've done. People wanting to censor dialogue on race and equity. Other issues with attitudes and dispositions. Reluctance. I'm not going to do this. I don't want to do it. I'm not going to do it. And just being upfront about it. Or here's one that we see pretty often. You can't make me do this. I'll go to, and then fill in the blank about what that might be. The union, the faculty senate, the staff senate, my cousin who happens to be on the board, whatever it might be, right? So we see that as something that's pretty common. These are all patterns across, again, the colleges that we've worked with, primarily in California. Maybe some of it resonates, I'm not sure. Conflating equity and equality. Equity is basically recognizing that there's some groups that need additional focus because there's gaps. Equality is treating everyone the same. Can't tell you how many times we're sitting down, we're having a conversation about equity, which is a focus of this plan, right? And people are saying, well, shouldn't we treat everyone the same? And they have a hard time with understanding that because they've maybe been taught from their own way of being raised that the right thing to do is to treat everyone the same. If you want to be a good person, you treat everyone the same. But unfortunately, our society, treating everyone the same only continues to produce a status quo, which doesn't treat everyone the same. So it's hard for them to wrap their minds around that. Or questions like, hey, we've identified a certain faculty group that might be experiencing disproportionate impact. We need to do more around hiring for the certain faculty group. So why are we focused on, let's say that it ends up being our LGBT faculty. Why are we focused on our LGBT faculty? Why aren't we there's such a small population. Shouldn't we be focused on our other faculty? Other ones that are similar. We tried to hire a minority faculty member, but we just couldn't find one that was qualified. I remember the first time I ever sat on a diversity committee for a college. I went into the room. First of all, I didn't want to sit on the committee because I'm like, okay, great. First day I'm there on the job as a faculty member, first day as assistant professor, I'm asked, oh, you know what? We think you'd be good to sit on the diversity committee. I was like, oh, well, why do you think that would be? Oh, we just thought, your background, like, oh, you mean because I'm black? So anyways, oftentimes, I sat on the diversity committee and didn't really have a choice. First meeting, they're going to implement a new plan for diversity. And basically the conversation around the table is, but wait a second, if we do this, aren't we going to be lowering quality? I'm sitting right there, right? And the conversation is about, if we have this focus on bringing in diverse faculty, how are we going to maintain our standard? I didn't want to say at that time because I try to be as much of a humble person as I can be, but I had more publications than everybody in the room combined. But they were questioning that. So something for us to keep in mind. Here we go. Politics and power dynamics. Territorialism oftentimes becomes a problem for us, right? Particularly between academic services or academic affairs and student affairs or student services. Why is student affairs leading this initiative? It should be led by academic affairs or vice versa. Why is it being led by academic affairs? Shouldn't this be a student? You know what? We're all responsible for student success. That's why, when the provost was talking earlier, right? It's a big plan for our academic programs, right? And all these plans are supposed to feed into it. Here we go. This would be an amazing program for students, but it would require significant collaboration between academic affairs and student affairs. I just don't think we can do that right now. Here's one we also see, interim leadership. People being scared to basically move too much or rock the boat if they have an interim or acting title. Our dean really wants to support this, but she's an intern right now and she can't push too hard. We can come up with all kinds of reasons. My department has an advisory board for our programs. So it would be our advisory board doesn't really care about equity. I don't know if we should do that. In fact, so I run our EDD program in community college leadership. And one of our most important advisory board members is a local college leader. I want to be real careful. I'm being recorded. Is a local college leader, right, who's very prominent and very important. And let's just say that I had had an intentional focus on equity and excellence in terms of recruiting for the program. So the faces in the program have probably changed since this person started sitting on the advisory board. And it was a question that my chair pulled me aside and said, this advisory board member is really concerned with what you've done with the program. They're saying that you're turning the program into a social justice program. I said, you mean we have people of color in the program now? Is that what you mean? Because it was coded. I mean, that's what they were really referring to, right? But there can be pushback, right? So we have to expect that. Here we go, structures. We have turnovers in leadership. Our previous chair was really effective in advancing the equity agenda, but he or she left to take a position at another university. Other issues such as that are structural, built environment. By the way, this campus is gorgeous. It's one of the best campuses I've ever seen. I'm like, goodness gracious, I just want to stay here. But in terms of the built environment, right? It's not uncommon for us to find that the classes that people don't really want to teach are the classes that typically have the highest percentages of our most underserved students in them. And then the individuals who are teaching those classes, who oftentimes happen to be part-timers, don't have offices on campus. If they do, they're located in bungalows, or they have an office space that they're sharing with 3 or 4 other individuals. And it says something about what we think about effectively engaging our most underserved and students who are in the need of the most support by placing them in classrooms with faculty who simply cannot provide it, not because they don't have the desire to, but because we've structured the campus to essentially prevent that kind of engagement. A commitment to equity is not embedded in our institutional structures. So, and here's an example of that. There's programs on this campus that serve diverse populations. In fact, here we go. I just went to the incredible multicultural center that you have. By the way, one of the most incredible buildings I've ever seen for a multicultural center. Ours is like this little room. Anyways, so people might say, but wait a second, all that equity work is supposed to take place in multicultural affairs, or insert the name of some program. Name that program. That's what we say. Name that program. Equity really begins with us. Resource constraints. Yeah, we'd like to do that, but we don't really have the money, space, or people to do it. Or we can only offer this support while we have diversity funding, and that's one-time funding. It might go away. Or we have structural issues with transportation and parking. We have students who we know are adversely impacted by that, and that might be one of the things that comes out as part of the inquiry. So here's 2 things we commonly hear. We have limited student parking. If they want to park on campus, they need to arrive by 8 a.m. Or we don't have good public transportation for them to even get on campus. So 2 more, and then I'll move to some next steps. Some institutional culture issues is another one. We end up doing things where we become activity focused, where we have this list of all these different things that we're going to do. And it's like these 10,000 things, but none of them are meaningful. 10,000 things that sound good. And we can talk about all these things that we're doing, but if it hasn't changed anything, if it hasn't helped to redress the gaps, then it's not really helping us. An overcommitment to the status quo. Typically, we find this when there is money that's on the table, now there's an equity plan, now there's going to be some money. And you know how many programs in California are now funding their STEM centers through their equity funds? It's so how did they justify that? Well, it's important for us to increase the diversity of people who are going into science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Okay, cool, that's important. So what are we doing about recruitment? Oh, well, this is a retention program, so we don't do recruitment here. Or we're going to use it to pay for labs. So we use it to pay for things that are already in place. We tend to support the status quo rather than making change. And then the last one, which is going to be extremely important because of the nature of the plan and really trying to engage in inquiry, is access to data and having good data. So it's not uncommon for us to see in the work that I do, institutional researchers serving as gatekeepers to being able to do the work that's meaningful. Now, we have campuses that are hit and miss. Some of them have amazing institutional researchers. Some of them have institutional researchers that simply don't care. Some of them have institutional researchers that do care, but they're so overloaded with all the mandated reporting that there's just not simply the capacity to do so. And if you're going to engage a true equity effort, it doesn't start at just the campus level. It goes down to the division and unit level. It requires each division and each unit to look at their data, to say, here are our outcomes in this class.
here are our outcomes in this program based and disaggregated by all the groups that are mentioned in the report as being our minoritized or our marginalized populations, and then creating a plan at that divisional level to be able to do something. That requires a lot of extra support. Not disaggregating data, having an over-reliance on either qualitative data or quantitative data, those are some patterns. So thinking about all the campuses we partner with, just some things that we've seen as important for success. And this is my concluding remarks. So one, if we're going to really move forward an agenda, it requires this to be student-centric. If we're not talking about this as a function of student success, then we're missing the mark. If it's about me, if it's about if it's about my promotion, if it's about what's good for my career, and we take the eyes off the fact that the whole point that we're here is because we're here to serve students, then it doesn't get done. We have to have continuous involvement from campus leaders. And it has to be the right campus leaders. I can't tell you how many times efforts like this become segmented. Right? It's going to be in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, right? It's their role over here, and then that's it. So it requires that the president, that the provost, that the vice presidents, that the deans, that the faculty senate president, if there's a faculty union, that the faculty union president, that the staff senate, the staff union, that those are individuals who are repeatedly saying that this is important, because if they don't, it's not going to happen. Best case in point is one of the colleges that we worked with, that I think has had the most benefit from the partnership with us. It was a partnership focused on men of color. So basically, they had their convocation at the beginning of the year. Now, for a president, the convocation is one of the most important times that they have, because it's one of the few times that most everybody is there, or most of the people who are most engaged, and they have an opportunity to say something that they think is important. And so we went to a college that we partner with, it's Chaffey College, and the president gets up on stage and he says, here's our data on our men of color. And just starts showing their data. And says, you know what? I usually have a lot of remarks for you. I usually have a lot of things that I want to say. But you know what? I'm going to send you an email with the updates. Instead, you know what we're going to do today? I'm going to use my time and I'm going to turn it over to Frank and Luke, my colleague, Frank and I. And I'm going to have them come up here and talk about what we're going to do for men of color on our campus over the next 3 years. And we laid out what the plan is going to be and what that entailed. But it wasn't just the president saying it. In the front row, supporting the president and saying it, was the members of their board of trustees, was their faculty senate president and their faculty union president, their staff senate president and their staff union, all sitting in the front saying, this is something that we think is important. Guess what? When that occurs, if you think about those past resistors, organizational priority, all right, well, I guess we got to get on board with this men of color thing. Might be reluctance at first, but we can encourage them to care. Setting targets for disproportionate impact within each department. Again, using data within each different department to identify so that we can bring and breathe life into this. The report is a guide. It gives us a path there, but the information that we look at and the disproportionate impact groups within our own departments in our own areas, that's where we have to focus. And then it's not just about talking about it once and leaving it be, but it's having a standing division item at every single meeting where this is going to be the first conversation we have. Okay, so what are we doing about this? What are we doing to move forward this agenda? And then lastly, it involves being intrusive. And again, that example that I gave you with one of the colleges that we're partnering with, where, you know what? We're not doing microaggression training at brown bags anymore. We're going in and we're meeting people face to face who don't necessarily want to have the conversation. And you know what? By the end of the conversation, they find out, you know what? That really wasn't that bad. It wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. I mean, I feel like, wow, I should be doing more. And you know what? Maybe I'm going to commit to doing something more. But it involves being intrusive with them. So my, I guess, last remark to you is this. Remember that we have different populations. We have our choir, we have our allies, we have our resistors, and we have our defiant. Thank you for being part of the choir. Let's go get the allies and the passive resistors. So I think we have time, it seems, for maybe a question or two. Any questions, comments, fears, trepidations? Yes.
I was really happy that you mentioned, especially when you were showing data, that there's some groups that are not included. I was really happy that you included that statement.
Yeah.
And I was wondering about some of your perspectives on folks that, we are not collecting data on and therefore don't have the data, such as the LGBTQ population and ability population.
Yes.
And I'd just like to know your thoughts on that.
Well, it's one of the most pervasive issues that we have. And so that's why with a lot of the work that I do, we collect that data as part of our assessments because it's oftentimes ignored. Another group that typically gets lost in the mix is a racial group, which is Asian American Pacific Islander. We find, particularly in California, we have a large Southeast Asian population, so Hmong, Cambodian, Laotian, Vietnamese, who typically have experiences and outcomes that are very similar to that of Black and Latino students and Native American students. So they have outcomes that are very different from that of what they might be typically aggregated, and you don't see it, right? Because it's not broken out. So I think that we have to think about that in terms of race. We have to think about it in terms of our LGBT students. The gender question, male, female, doesn't work, right? We need to be asking about, transgender, gender nonconforming. We're missing a lot in terms of the data that we have. And we're not going to be able to do anything unless we have that kind of data, right? I mean, how can you address and talk about a problem where there's nothing to support it? So what it does is it creates invisibility, which only serves to reify oppression that these groups face. So I'll go here and then here.
Hi, jag är Charlie-ska Ganesha, nash Ejatapahan Place, and Digna Bashchin, Ashim Deshay, Dolkin Sanitas Milan, and Nashna. Everyone, my name is Charlie. I'm a first year graduate scholar in the CSP program, and I'm from the Middle of the Alpha Nation Organization, Pacific Nation, Arizona. So, my question for you, so I appreciate your plan and sort of like your advice because it requires sort of like cultural shift. My question is that a lot of this culture just still has colonial undertones, especially since like Native folks and Indigenous peoples in general are never going to feel supported or accepted in spaces that have and continue to silence, erase, and disenfranchise them. So like for example,
Agreed.
well actually several, URI is a land-grant institution, so there is that deep history of like displacement and like removing Native folks and giving them land for other purposes, quote unquote. In addition, you were the only one out of all the speakers today that mentioned Native folks and continues to sort of like bring it, but it's not enough. I understand because your focus is particularly Black men.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is like, how can decolonization or ways to center Indigenous thought and knowledges can occur within the strategic plan, but also like where is the community outreach happening both within your program, within your strategies, and within this movie?
Okay. So I can answer that in terms of what I talked about, but I think that some of those questions are questions to be better directed towards the campus and really encouraging the campus to think about what's next. So Native American Indigenous populations are oftentimes ignored in the data, partially because of sample size, right? So we have a smaller sample size, and there's a reason for that, right? And as a result, then those communities don't get talked about, and then it becomes like this invisibility. In the work that we do, we specifically collect that. We try to have a focus because we believe that it's important to elevate populations that are minoritized. And again, my work does focus on Black males, but I think that there are some oppression is oppression, right? Now it looks different for each community, but it is oppression. So I think with this campus, I think, one thing that's going to be important is we're talking about indigenous methodologies and indigenous epistemologies and teaching practices, right? What we really need to do is think about, I bet you most people in the room might not even ever heard that before, just even those titles, let alone know what that looks like, right? So it's about an intensive, ongoing professional development. Right? But that's like a starting point, right? The other part is
is it instead of us coming up with what that needs to look like, it needs to be a conversation. It needs to be a conversation with a true commitment that comes behind it. Because oftentimes what we do is we'll pay lip service. I think about San Diego State. San Diego State's no different, right? San Diego State has even the buildings that we have with the mission architecture, and we think about the history of what has taken place on my own campus. As I was preparing for my Black Minds Matter course, right, that I'm about to do, several faculty in Native American Studies wrote me and they said, we want you to acknowledge that while you're talking about these issues, and it's putting San Diego State out there as someone who's talking about these issues, that San Diego State has a history of marginalization and oppression, particularly for indigenous communities, right? So I think it's about being open and honest about it and not hiding it. I think that's another one of the important pieces to it. So in terms of what that looks like, I think that's got to be very specific to this region and to this campus. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I know that there's people here who care about that, and I'm sure that they have some ideas in place, and I hope that you all can connect and figure out what that looks like with a true commitment. So, but thank you.
Are you able to go back to your 3D slide?
If the slides, they're not working anymore. It's like, I kind of stopped because, yeah. Which one was it?
3 E's.
The 3 E's, yeah.
Yeah, so with the,
Empower, educate, and encourage.
right, and I think that as, when you try to relate that to how you deal with staff as opposed to faculty, I think that for the third E, the motivations are a little bit different with staff as opposed to faculty, right? Tenure and promotion isn't quite there, release time isn't really a thing, and so I think the strategies have to change a little bit. And I'm wondering if you have any performance management strategies that you think are more specific to staff as opposed to faculty.
So I would view these as kind of their principles, right? But the examples I gave were definitely faculty-centric, mostly because it was part of unveiling and rolling out a program that was designed for teachers and faculty, right? So I don't want to be exclusive, but that's important. So in terms of reaching staff, I think it's about identifying what are the things that motivate people, right? And I think you could probably come up with what that list looks like, and then basically taking that and then applying it. Okay, so these are the carrots that people actually care about. And every campus is different, right? Because on some campuses, staff do have retention, tenure, and promotion, right? So there's places in Minnesota I can think of that have that system. They might not have release time, but you might have scheduling priority, right? You might have things in terms of areas of responsibility, in terms of being able to go to certain conferences and professional development opportunities. So I think that there's things that are very specific that we just it's about identifying very tangible things, because with people who are passive resistors, they're never going to move past that point unless we reach them. So being intrusive and then using those carrots initially, then hopefully we can get them to a point where they care, and then we're beyond that, hopefully they're engaging because they really want to engage. But what I will do, because I'm not able to go back, is I'm going to share slides. I'll send a PowerPoint of this, and anybody who wants to have it, you can take, please, look at it. You'll see some stuff in here that I didn't go over that you might think is interesting. One quick thing that I'll give it as an example, and unfortunately it's a very gendered example, but it talks about the importance of everybody being on board. And many of you may have heard this before. I don't think it's actually a true story, but it's like an urban legend that early in the 1970s, President John F. Kennedy had visited NASA to tour the facilities. He reportedly asked the janitor, "What do you do here?" The janitor responded, "I'm here to help put a man on the moon." Right? It's this notion that we all have responsibility. And let me tell you, from the work that I do, if we're thinking about this, like a true equity plan involves everyone: custodians, food service workers, presidents, vice presidents. It involves everyone. In fact, if I think about just the work that we do with men of color, one of the first studies that I did, we were talking about what does your engagement look like with your faculty members outside the classroom. They say, when I see a faculty member outside of class, you know what they do? They walk by me, they walk the other direction, they pretend to get on their phone so they can avoid interacting with me. It's a common theme that we hear on many of the campuses that we go to. And so as part of our research, then we usually ask them as a follow-up, well, then who do you engage with? And they tell us that the individuals who validate them, who say, you know, proud of you, young man, keep your heads in the books, keep going, don't give up, you're doing good work, so proud of you for being here. The people who give them those validating messages, the janitors, the custodians, and the food service workers. And oftentimes, if we think about the racial ethnic population and what the individuals in those capacities oftentimes look like, they oftentimes are reflective of communities of color. So recognizing that it's not just the people in this room, it's not just our faculty and staff, our faculty and student services colleagues or administrators, it's everyone on this campus if we're really going to move forward an agenda. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wood. That was super inspiring, and I think you captured everything we've been talking about as a CED staff, all the directors, and with Naomi and others. We've been talking about the importance of not just talking the talk, but walking the walk, right? And I love that you talked about it from that multicultural organizational development perspective, which talks about it's really at the individual level, the group levels, and of course at the institutional levels. I do want to just pause and talk a little bit about the rest of the day, what we're going to do. But before I do that, I really wanted to give a shout out to Eileen Orabone. Again, I know we mentioned, she's over there hiding in the back. Come on now, Eileen. Eileen literally is the admin for all of the centers, and in one way or the other, she supports us in so many ways. And I always have to give a shout out to Eileen, because I love you, Eileen, and I appreciate everything that you do for us. So that being stated, I also want to give a shout out to the I-standers that were the staff at the front desk, just sort of greeting you and directing you. So I just want to give a shout out to the I-standers and also Keith LaBelle. As far as the rest of the day, a huge part of what we're talking about is what are we going to do with what we learned today? Right? I'm sure that's what you're all thinking, and every presenter has touched on the importance of moving it to practice, right? Theory to practice. And so what we're going to do is two things. We have a number of sessions, but Saronica Carenti, who is our intern for community and organizational development, is going to be handing out a sheet. And the teacher in me had to make it a teachable moment, right? So she's handing out a sheet, and the sheet basically just says, I learned, and there's a space to write whatever you think you learned, whatever you took away, and 2 or 3 action steps that you will commit to. And I know sometimes when you look at a strategic plan, it's super intimidating. Oh my gosh, I've got to do all of this? No. Just imagine if, for a moment, if we all just did one thing. We all committed to doing one thing that we saw in the plan, or one thing that we heard today. And that's what we're asking and inviting you all to do, because we're all going to commit to it as a group. So when you look at the agenda for the rest of the day, you'll see that we have 2 sets of sessions. We have one session with Dr. Wood, who's going to elaborate some more. It's going to be a Q&A to delve a little deeper into some of the questions that you may have. At the same time, we're going to have a second session with Dr. Eric Caldor, who's going to talk about advancing URI along the intercultural development continuum, and that's in Atrium. Both of those things will be in Atrium 1 and 2, so you can just kind of go over there and you'll see. And then what we'll do is we'll have a second set of sessions. One will be creating inclusive learning spaces, advice from students. So that's going to be sort of like a fishbowl exercise where some students from the College Student Personnel Program, facilitated by Anne Marie Vaccaro, are going to talk about their experiences, what it's like to be a graduate student. And then at the same time, Dr. Kayon Murray Johnson, which you'll see some information about all the speakers on the back, she's going to talk about responding to emotional triggers in the classroom and beyond, because we know, like Naomi mentioned this morning, there's a lot going on in our world, and we don't always know how to respond. So, and then we'll conclude the day with lunch, and concluding remarks with Dr. David Dooley, our president, and Dr. Abigail Ryder, our vice president for business and finance. Okay? So thank you all for coming from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. And I'll see you all at lunch.
Good afternoon. We are fortunate to have President Dooley here to give closing remarks. We thank you once again for coming and being a part of this day and the rollout of and the launch of our strategic plan. I am thrilled to introduce President Dooley, who has been a consistent supporter of work of community equity and diversity over the 5 years that I have been here at the University of Rhode Island. When we were in the process of developing this University of Rhode Island Community Equity and Diversity Strategic Plan, the question came up over and over again: is this CED's plan? Is this the university's plan? Whose plan is it, and how will it be applied? And ultimately, it is the decision of President Dooley and the university that has to vet these strategic plans. But it was President Dooley who said, this is a university strategic plan that is to be owned by all of us, not just the work of the Office of Community Equity and Diversity. So it is my pleasure to introduce President Dooley to give closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi, and thanks to everybody here for joining us today. I'm not going to be very long. I'm very pleased to know I'm not in between you and lunch, and you can feel free to keep eating while I'm standing up here. I will not take offense. I want to begin by expressing both my personal gratitude and my thanks on behalf of the university community, which as president I get to do occasionally, for the great work that Naomi and Joanna, Fernando, Keith, and Eileen, the central staff of the Division of Community Equity and Diversity did in developing this strategic plan. It took an enormous amount of work, especially on Joanna's part, and almost probably an equal amount of work on Naomi's part, to make sure that we had the kind of input and buy-in that would establish this as a university plan and not just simply the ideas, no matter how good or well conceived they might be, that came out of a single part of the university. So we know that students had a lot to say about this plan. We know that faculty and faculty senate had a lot to say about this plan. We know that staff were engaged. We know that many elements of the university participated, had a chance to review, comment, revise, and otherwise be engaged in the development of this strategic plan. And it truly is then, in my judgment, a university document. And it's an important university document, because what this plan does is it now codifies, not just for us, but for our successors, that our commitment to community and equity and diversity has momentum, which we all know, but more importantly, that it has a sustained commitment on the part of the institution to implement the plan that has been developed. And this then becomes a guide for how the university will assess and evaluate its progress towards building a community devoted to equity and simultaneously very diverse over time. That remains and will remain, at least as long as I'm president of the University of Rhode Island, one of the 4 transformational goals of the institution, equally important, equal in importance to our goals around a 24/7 learning environment, research productivity and impact, and globalization. Those are the things that will be hallmarks of the university. They have been for the last 8 years. They'll continue to be hallmarks for the university as we go forward. They will be central elements in the university's forthcoming capital campaign, which will begin in January of 2018. And the goals that are embodied in this strategic plan will become fundraising goals for the institution, high priority fundraising goals for the institution. And that, I think, is one of the many reasons why having a plan like this that we can point out to prospective donors and funders of different sorts, I think is an important consequence, an important impact of having this plan available to the university community for us to guide our work, as well as to enable us to recruit other individuals, entities, organizations, and donors to the work that we're trying to accomplish here at the University of Rhode Island. So I want to thank everybody for their really hard work on this, all of you who were engaged, and obviously the CED staff, who I've already thanked, the interns you probably pulled in to help you in this work. I know their contributions were important as well. And I hope that all of you will communicate to the university community as a whole the importance of this element of our future together. And I just am so proud of the fact that we have this plan. It was years in the making. But it's important to recognize that this plan may not, and probably is not, perfect. Nothing we do here at this institution, since everything we do here at this institution is done by people, insofar as I am aware. I've received no communications signed by God since I arrived at the University of Rhode Island. If I did, I would regard that probably as perfect. But this is the work of people, and therefore it is by definition going to be imperfect. But more importantly, it's going to be imperfect because the university is not a static organization. It's a constantly growing and evolving collection of people, priorities, facilities, goals, and aspirations. And therefore, this plan cannot be static. So if you find imperfections in it now, don't be concerned. Note them down. We will evaluate our success for this in working to implement this plan. We will continually evaluate it against the changes that the university undergoes over time. We'll evaluate it against the progress we make, and we'll change it. That's what a living plan must be. If it's going to be valuable to us, it has to be valuable for more than 6 months. And if we want it to be valuable for more than 6 months, then it's got to be amendable. It's got to be changeable. And all of us will be involved in that. And that is work almost, in fact, one could say, is as important as the work in creating the document that's before us today. So the bad news is your work isn't finished, those of you who worked on this, because this will be a living document that we'll continue to work on and revise and change over time. One of the things about a community is that a community is tolerant of one another's mistakes. And we have to be tolerant of one another's mistakes because we want to innovate. We want to drive change. My PhD advisor, I learned a lot from him, but one of the things he taught me, it was in the realm of chemistry that he taught me this, but I've generalized it now to everything I try to do as president of the University of Rhode Island and to this institution. One of the lessons I learned from him early on in my career as a PhD student was this: if you aren't willing to take the risk of failure, if you're not willing to be wrong, you'll never do anything important. And that's true for us. We're going to try to do great things here. Occasionally we'll get it wrong. Occasionally we'll make mistakes. We want to minimize those, of course. But the importance is that we commit together with one another that we will learn from those mistakes and we'll go on from there. And that's what this plan is about too. It gives us a framework to innovate. It gives us a framework to try things. It gives us a framework to fail, get up, and try again to create the kind of community that we want to create here at the University of Rhode Island. So in all respects, this is a document that I hope you will internalize and not memorize, because it's a lengthy document, as it needs to be for the complexity and size of an institution like the University of Rhode Island. But internalize what it's about, what it means, what its goals, aspirations, what its spirit, the spirit of the institution that's reflected in this document, and we'll work together to keep it alive and viable and a guide to the university's future for years to come. So thank you, each and every one, today and in the future, for your work on this important document.
an effort to be inclusive of the senior leadership team, we also asked Abigail Ryder to come in and give us a few comments. Abigail Ryder is probably the newest, are you the newest member of the senior leadership team? Yes, and so we want to give her a warm welcome. And,
Thank you.
She's the rookie.
I'm the rookie. Yeah, thank you. I really, it's difficult going, after President Dooley, but I thought I would address the whole issue of why it's important to me that we develop a community of equity and inclusion. Globalization, as you know, has made the world very small. We no longer have the ability to comfortably divide the world into us and them. Although many of us are actually threatened by the notion that we are all us. And you see this over and over again, people trying to create a them that somehow we don't have to be concerned with. It's easier to define yourself by how you differ from others than to recognize commonalities. Yet this is what we have to do because due to increased mobility and the internet and the smallness of the planet and the country compel us to really understand that we really are all us. I had the opportunity while I was in college to live in a tiny village in the Andes for an extended period of time. Quechua was the dominant language and only a few people spoke Spanish. There are very few places and people on the planet that are more different from my native New England than this village. Yet I made lifelong friends there, and I cherish that experience because in the end, the things that we all aspire to in life, safety, health, learning, a feeling of self-worth, and love, are the same. We must all develop the ability to communicate, understand, and engage productively while embracing and acknowledging differences. The Office of Community Equity and Diversity is charged with fostering these values on campus, and we thank them for their work. It's also up to each of us as individuals to follow their lead and ensure that everything we do here embodies those principles. And in the end, it is both incredibly difficult and quite simple to do. We need to apply the golden rule. The golden rule is about empathy. Would I want to be treated the way I am treating someone? Have I understood how my thoughts and actions may affect someone else? Are there unexamined assumptions in my speech or actions that hurt others? Am I excluding someone by applying hidden standards, standards other than those that set forth and agreed upon in the job description, in the course curriculum, in the membership eligibility criteria? Our goal here at the university is to create an inclusive and supportive environment where each individual can thrive. Please join me and my division in wholeheartedly embracing this goal and committing to implement this strategic plan. Thanks.